Okay, I guess it's time to start. Okay. A little bit about myself first. So I'm a solution architect. I've been doing it for 6 years now, one of which was with Yonder. I've been doing .NET for 14 years. I've been playing with other technologies in the meantime, but .NET is still my first love. And I'm also interested in IoT and ML, but those are for other presentations, not today. Before we start, let's go through a little story. A few years back, I was talking to a sysadmin friend of mine, and he was a little upset. Now that's normal because he's a sysadmin, but I did ask him why he was upset, and he told me he was upset because of Adfs. At the time I laughed and I was like, haha, that's funny. Turns out he was trying to configure Adfs to work with Azure AD so he could integrate the company services at the time with Office 365. That was all nice and good until last year when working on a project, I was given the following problem. We have a company product that is designed to work in multiple kinds of setups. You have the local installation, you have the multi-tenant local installation, we have the cloud installation, plus a few more other versions. Now, what's the problem? Our application supports multiple kinds of login, among which NTLM. This is the standard protocol for authentication inside the LAN or VPN using Active Directory. However, one of the customers didn't want to link their Active Directory forest with our Active Directory forest. They didn't want to share their, what's it called? They didn't want to share trust between the two organizations. So they needed some other way of getting Active Directory to log into their system. A bit of research later, I stumbled onto NTFS, not NTFS, ADFS, sorry, too many letters. So I immediately knew that I may have a problem on my hands because I knew ADFS was somewhat hard to configure. A bit of light reading later, I discovered that NTLM indeed is quite complicated to install, but if you skip the documentation from Microsoft and go straight to the online courses, you have a pretty good chance of doing it right. Anyway, one VM later that had all of the necessary services installed, like Active Directory and certificate management, and all of this stuff, plus NTFS, I was then able to start working on integrating NTFS into the application. A bit more light reading later, I discovered that the best way to do it is to use OpenID Connect, which is the latest flavor of authentication that seems to be cool with the kids these days. So I did that. Took a while to figure out exactly how to configure it in the configuration for ADFS, but after some trial and error, it was up and running. A few days later, after configuring the new OpenID Connect installation in the application to work correctly with the other authentication methods, we had something up and running. At this point, I was quite happy because I, in my mind, had managed to do something that was relatively complicated and managed to solve a problem for our customer. I don't think it was 1 week later that I get another call from a different project. Hey, we have an old land-based application that we're porting to web. Okay, that's not very complicated. What's the problem? Well, we used to rely on NTLM authentication for the users, but that's not the smartest thing when working with a web application, and we would like to open it up to users from various domains that should have access to our system. So of course, my mind goes ding and says ADFS. 2 days later, we had the system all set up and working fine. About a month later, on the first application, installation was going towards actually deploying the solution for our customer. And we had to set up their ADFS server correctly to work with ours. That actually took 2 days. And I'm going to explain why a little later. But anyway, what is ADFS? ADFS is a service from Microsoft that's built on top of Active Directory, and it does one thing very well, and that is federate the Active Directory directory to various applications that might want to use it. So it's basically an authentication and or authorization as a service. You normally set this up whenever you want to work with services that are in Azure or you want Office 365 to work, or you need this for single sign-on in various applications. How does it work? Well, basically it takes the directory information from Active Directory, and then it offers up that information through various authentication protocols. And it allows you to connect multiple applications to your AD setup. Okay, so let's talk about the advantages that Active Directory Federation Services has over just other services. So first of all, it supports many authentication standards. These are just the biggest ones that I could find. So it supports certificate authentication, smart card, external multi-factor authentication providers, and most importantly, OpenID Connect and SAML 2.0. Why is SAML 2.0 important? Because lots of legacy applications are built around it. Why is OpenID Connect important? Because most of the new applications that are built have flows that are either oriented towards mobile applications, IoT, or web applications, and OpenID Connect is specifically designed to solve all of these issues. Another big advantage that it has is that it has a robust claims mechanism. This means that you can administer the capabilities of your users by mapping various primitives from Active Directory onto claims. That means you can map roles, you can map groups. Scopes aren't necessarily that important, but you can also work with tenants, and it allows you to do this mapping in a very flexible manner. So whenever you connect an application to Azure AD, you have to set up some secrets, but you then also have to set up the mapping rules for whatever claims you want your application to support. I don't know if you're familiar with how claims-based authorizations work, but basically what happens is that after you have authenticated a user, the user comes back to your application with a token that encodes the user's relevant information as well as some claims. Now, these claims allow you to have stuff like roles, groups, and stuff like this, but you can also add custom claims specific to that particular application, which means that you can easily administer from AD whatever things you have to set up. Now, one thing to note here is that if you set up your application to work with an ADFS server from a customer, what you need to do is pay particular attention to how you do the claims mapping, because this is what's going to end up dictating the rights that users will be working with. Also, it's very nice that claims-based systems also support adding claims from inside the application. So for instance, you have some domain-specific claims that you would want to get from the domain, but you may also have specific application claims which you might want to administer from the application. So for instance, you have roles or groups that the user might be in inside an organization. You might want to give them rights based on that, but you might also want to give users rights, either temporary or permanent, from inside your application for easier administration by somebody who doesn't necessarily have the access or knowledge to AD administration. So from this point, it's really nice. Another big advantage, why is this not working? Another big advantage is that you can connect across domains without establishing trust. So what happens is that when you use AD to authenticate a user, the user delegates the application delegates the authentication to the Active Directory service. When you're using Adfs, you're actually delegating that to the customer's Adfs server. This means that besides the initial setup of the Adfs connection, so that you get the secrets for your application, so on and so forth, you no longer have any problems administering the service. You don't have to connect AD first, so on and so forth. You just have to connect the user with the Adfs application. Now, if you have multiple Adfs servers connected to the application, you may have, so for instance, if you have multiple tenants, you may have to modify the UI application to allow a user to select the tenant in which they want to authenticate. And based on this tenant, you need to choose the Adfs server that is appropriate for that user. This is something that doesn't exist in AD authentication, because if you already have your domain connected with theirs, you can go through the AD server connections. But when you're using Adfs, you're going to need something like a drop-down, which allows the user to select that, or based on their authentication information, decide which tenant that user belongs to, and then use that as authentication. Another big advantage is that you or your customers already have it set up. If they're using Office 365 or most, if not all, Azure services, they kind of need this to work correctly. You also may have Azure AD also set up, which Azure AD offers Adfs as a protocol, well, not a protocol, as a service that is built in. So basically the way Azure AD talks to the rest of the web and browsers and so on is through some cloud version of Adfs. Cool, let's move on to disadvantages. Adfs is relatively hard to set up the first time because there are a lot of theoretical concepts that you need to understand if you want to do this. It takes a bit of effort, it takes a bit of reading. You need to have some exercises where you set it up once or twice to get it working. So for instance, in my particular case, I installed it on 2 VMs, one with Windows Server 2016 and one with Windows Server 2019, just because I didn't know at the moment exactly which installation the customer had, and I wanted to make sure that both are compatible, because, you know, sometimes bad things happen between versions. And this greatly helped me when dealing with further requests for dealing with Adfs, because at that point I was kind of proficient in all of the primitives that I needed to know to understand what works and what doesn't. And I was able to relatively easily figure out what changes needed to be done. However, if you have somebody that hasn't worked with this and doesn't really understand doesn't really have the domain knowledge about administering ADFS, what rights go where, how certificates work and stuff like this, they may have a bit of a problem. Anyway, another big problem with it is that it's very hard to explain. Because there are so many concepts that you have to know when working with the system administrator from your customer, you may have to more or less do this work yourself through a remote desktop or some other service. Because trying to explain the setup to somebody is relatively hard. I wasn't able to do it. That's why it took 2 days on the first installation, because on the first day I was trying to communicate to the sysadmin exactly what needed to be done, but I wasn't getting through. In the end, what happened is that on the next day we connected to the servers itself. We started making the changes together, and after that it was mostly smooth sailing. Another big problem with it is that it's super hard to debug. Why? Because you need to understand all of the connections that ADFS has to do with various other Active Directory services. So you first have the certificates that it needs in order to communicate with everything. Then it needs to connect to the AD server. This is usually done through SAML2. Then you need to understand how the connection works with your application and how stuff like OpenID Connect works while doing a challenge. These challenges tend to be pretty complicated to explain on their own, but when you're dealing with other situations created by the fact that you have multiple services working in tandem to create this connection, then you like get really complicated into the weeds, and it becomes super hard to understand exactly what's going on. So you really need a deep understanding of how Azure works, how AD works, how ADFS works, and how your browser works, also how your application works. And in a worst case scenario, dealing with VPNs and other situations that might cause issues because of networking related problems. Now, I would really recommend that if you are going to deal with ADFS sometime in the future, you really take the effort and set up your own environment in a VM or multiple VMs. Most of the tutorials I've seen on the internet deal with a proper installation of ADFS, which means actually having multiple machines for installing everything, which pretty much means you will have your own private cloud setup. On the other hand, it is completely possible to do this on a single VM, and it will really help you to understand exactly what's going on. If you take the effort to set this up on your own, then you will be familiar with all the ways in which ADFS can go wrong, how authentication can go wrong. All you need to do is set up the environment, create a test application, hook it up through OpenID Connect, and see that everything works. After that, you can start thinking about other risks that you might have when deploying your application. Okay, so I mentioned Azure AD as well as ADFS. I didn't really talk about how these things work. This is an image that I found on the web about how this works, but this is simplified to the point where it doesn't make sense anymore. Just you see arrows everywhere. I mentioned already that Azure AD is a service built on top of AD in the cloud and ADFS in the cloud. Whenever you're working with Azure AD, you're never actually dealing with the Active Directory servers. You're always dealing with ADFS, at least when it comes to authentication and authorization. So if you're familiar in working with that, then ADFS should be relatively simple for you to understand from an application development point of view. However, when it comes to networking and other problems, it's not really efficient, and you might have to do that personal setup just to see what the process entails. Another thing that's important to understand is the very complicated relationship between the servers. So in a mixed setup where you have your own private AD forest, you connect that to an ADFS server. Then the ADFS server is used by Azure AD to delegate authentication to the ADFS server. And in this way, Azure AD can get the domain information about your AD setup. Then whenever an authentication happens by a user, it doesn't go to your ADFS server. It actually goes to the ADFS server in Azure AD. I have a question here. How long did it take you to implement ADFS authentication on average? So the first time I did it, it was relatively complicated because I had to set up that machine environment, and I had to understand how ADFS works in the background, what requests go where, how to set up everything, which kind of authentication protocol to set up in ADFS, and so on and so forth. And that took a while, mostly because I needed to acquire the knowledge about how to do this. The second time, it was, I think, 2 days from start to finish, like taking the application, adding the code, testing it, seeing that it works. So what you have to think about is that if you're setting up the ADFS server, that's the biggest cost you are going to have, because your application should only have to integrate with OpenID Connect, which is an authentication protocol, and that's relatively well documented. This is the big advantage of OpenID Connect. Since it's a new technology, most people are writing about it. There are good tutorials on how to configure it. Most modern frameworks already have support for it. You can add libraries to help you connect to it. And in some cases, it's actually integrated. So for instance, when you create a new project in Visual Studio, you can just click a button and you have OpenID Connect integrated into your application. All you have to do is set up the connections. And even if that's not the case, you still only have to copy paste the code and add the settings for the application. So it's really not that complicated. The ADFS server setup is the one that is really the hardest. Now, having said that, let's move on to some conclusions. So assuming you have a business-to-business context, then ADFS is the way to go to make sure that you have a robust solution for single sign-on. This allows your users, as well as the users of any tenant that you have, to log in with ADFS. There are support for multiple protocols, which means that you have flexibility in integrating this into your applications. If you're using OpenID Connect, then you have support for mobile and IoT as well as web pages. If you have some older applications which rely on SAML, you can also set that up. If you have applications that work with NTLM, all you have to do is replace the NTLM implementation with the ADFS one, or have them set up to work in tandem, depending on, for instance, user ID or some other method of dictating which user gets to use which authentication method. It's relatively easy to use in your applications once you already have the server set up. And Azure AD is relatively useful if you have both B2B and B2C scenarios. Azure AD allows you to support users that have Microsoft linked accounts. So once that's set up, they can already have access to your application. Yeah, I guess this is it for the conclusions. If there are any more questions. I'm gonna take a wild guess and say they aren't. Oh no, wait, we do have one. Can you point out a good reading material for configuring an ADFS server? Reading material, not so much. The documentation from Microsoft literally takes you through everything that you need to set up. There is a relatively long 2-hour tutorial on YouTube about how to set up ADFS on its own. And it walks you through all of the resources that you have to set up. Although it does assume that you already have certificate authority and AD already set up, which is relatively trivial to install. I don't think I have how to look it up right now. Another question, have you any concerns with ADFS for working with certain protocols? I'm not sure exactly if ADFS for which version of Windows Server that works with. I haven't encountered any problems with ADFS in any of the setups that I've done not working with certain protocols. So I wouldn't know what to say about ADFS 4. I think the latest I've tried is 3, but I'm not sure. Are there any more questions? If not, I would like to thank you for listening to me, and I would wish you to enjoy the next presentation and have a nice evening. Goodbye.